Imagine 96 years of life on the ice, and now 1,000 hungry eyes stare at you from the dark. Not outside, but inside your own home. A Yakut grandmother, her orphaned grandchildren, and the longest night of their lives. The dense air of the ancestral log cabin, already heavy with the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs, now suffocated with a new, disturbing odor. The wild musk of 1,000 beasts. The illusion of safety that the thick log walls had always offered was gone. The darkness, once a familiar cloak, had transformed into a curtain hiding colossal presences, amber eyes glinting in the gloom. Akulina, her wrinkled hands clutching the small shoulders of Semyon and Lena, felt her grandchildren's tremor spread through her own body. It wasn't fear, not for her, but a resonance of the fragility life could impose. The silence, which should have been a relief, was more terrifying than any roar. It was a predatory silence, a prelude to the hunt. A deep growl, almost an amplified purr, vibrated through the floor beneath their feet. It didn't come from a single point, but seemed to emerge from all directions, a chorus of deep throats filling every crevice of the space. Lena let out a muffled sob, her face buried in her grandmother's skirt. Semyon, though older, was equally petrified, his wide eyes straining to discern shapes in the darkness. "Stay behind me," Akulina whispered, her voice a firm rock against the torrent of dread. Her vision, though weakened by age, was sharpened by urgency. She could feel the tigers' muscular mass, their hot, heavy breath now condensing in the cabin's icy air. How had they entered? The doors and windows were locked, sealed against the murderous cold lurking outside. The answer, she knew, didn't matter now. Reality was what weighed upon them. Her fingers, calloused by nearly a century of hard labor, fumbled across the floor. They found the handle of a snow shovel, forgotten there after an emergency clearing of the entrance. It wasn't a weapon, but it was something. She gripped it with a determination that belied her age. A massive shape detached itself from the darkness near the fireplace, the unmistakable silhouette of a Siberian tiger. Its eyes glowed with a supernatural intensity, fixed on them. The animal didn't advance, merely observed, a deadly patience emanating from its posture. It was as if it were waiting, assessing, and Akulina knew it wasn't the only one. She pulled her grandchildren closer, the warmth of their young bodies a fragile comfort against the 71 cold that still permeated the walls and the icy threat now surrounding them. The old woman took a deep breath, the scent of tiger invading her lungs. It was the smell of the forest, of snow, of wilderness in its purest, most relentless form. Akulina closed her eyes for an instant, invoking the memories of her ancestors, of tales of forest spirits and her people's unwavering resilience. She couldn't fight 1,000 tigers with a shovel, but she could fight with wisdom. She could fight with her mind. She needed to understand what they wanted. Why were they here? Tigers didn't invade homes, not in such numbers, not in such silence. Something was wrong, something deeply disturbing. A sudden movement in the opposite corner of the room made Semyon let out a stifled cry. A second tiger, even larger, emerged from the darkness, its steps soft and silent on the wooden floor. It moved towards the central table, where a pot of dried meat sat on a cloth. The smell of food, Akulina realized, was what attracted them. But it wasn't the only thing. There was a different hunger in the eyes that stared at her, a hunger that went beyond mere meat, a hunger for something deeper, more ancestral. Akulina raised the shovel, not in a gesture of attack, but as a symbolic barrier, her eyes fixed on those of the nearest tiger. "I am not afraid of you," she thought, projecting her will towards the beasts. It was a lie, of course, but it was a lie she needed them to believe. And more importantly, for her grandchildren to believe. The night, she realized, wouldn't just be long. It would be a test of every fiber of her existence, of every lesson learned under the Arctic sun and icy stars. The survival of her clan, of her lineage, now depended on her ability to decipher the enigma of the 1,000 hungry eyes surrounding her. And the first step, she knew was not to succumb. Never. Akulina's eyes opened, piercing the gloom that now seemed denser, more alive. The lie she had whispered to herself, "I am not afraid of you," it was now a shield, not just for her grandchildren, but for her own soul. She couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. The scent of musk and wet fur was overwhelming, an invisible cloak that weighed in the air, making every breath a struggle. Amber eyes multiplied in the darkness, spectral points of light that seemed to float, some low, others higher, revealing the immense scale of the invasion. There were so many that the cabin itself seemed to shrink, the thick log walls now a prison instead of a refuge. The tiger that had approached the table with the dried meat stopped, its muzzle raised, sniffing the air. It didn't touch the food. Its gaze, previously fixed on the pot, shifted to Akulina, a disturbing glint of intelligence in its vertical pupils. A low, guttural growl echoed again, but this time Akulina perceived a cadence, almost a rhythm, as if it were a communication, not merely a threat. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice hoarse but firm. She didn't expect an answer, of course, but the act of speaking, of projecting her presence, was an affirmation of her humanity against the overwhelming savagery. Semyon and Lena trembled against her legs, their small bodies vibrating with a fear so intense it could almost be heard. Akulina hugged them tighter, the warmth of their skin against hers, a bittersweet reminder of the life she was fighting to preserve. The snow shovel in her hands seemed pathetic. A child's weapon against a force of nature, but it wasn't for attack. It was to show that she wasn't defenseless, that she wouldn't give up. She noticed a subtle movement, not just any tiger, but the shadow of one. An even larger shape glided into the center of the log cabin, stopping a few feet from them. This one was different. Its fur seemed darker in the gloom, and its eyes, instead of amber, held a colder, almost bluish glint. It was the leader, she thought, the king of this ghostly horde. The leader didn't growl, it merely observed, its eyes fixed on hers. Akulina felt a shiver that didn't come from the external cold. It was a connection, a silent exchange that transcended the barrier between species. It seemed to be reading her, probing her soul, assessing her determination. The hunger in its eyes wasn't for meat. It was for something more abstract, deeper. Respect, recognition, or perhaps a veiled challenge to her own sovereignty over that patch of land. A faint scrape of claws on the wooden floor broke the heavy silence, coming from behind the leader. Akulina didn't look. Her eyes remained fixed on those of the main tiger, a battle of wills fought in an oppressive silence. She remembered the ancient tales, her people's legends of the masters of the forest, the spirits who could take animal form, who tested the hearts of men. Was this a test, an ancestral trial? Lena's small hands clutched her skirt with renewed force. A stifled sob escaped the girl's lips. Akulina realized the silence was unbearable for the children. She needed to break the tension, to give them something to focus on, beyond the immediate threat. "Semyon, Lena," she whispered, her voice a little louder this time, but still calm. "Do you remember the story of the bear and the fox? How the fox, even small, used its cleverness to trick the giant bear?" Semyon's eyes blinked, trying to process his grandmother's words amidst the terror. Lena, her face still buried, let out a whimper. Akulina knew they weren't truly listening to the story, but the sound of her voice, the familiarity of a tale, was a small point of light in the darkness. It was an anchor. The tiger leader tilted its head slightly, as if listening. Its eyes didn't waver. Akulina felt a flicker of hope, a small flame flickering in the cold. They weren't attacking. They were waiting, but waiting for what? The answer seemed locked in that tiger's eyes, an enigma she needed to unravel before predatory patience ran out. The night deepened, and with it the certainty that this was no ordinary invasion, but a clash of worlds, where ancestral wisdom would be the only true weapon. Akulina, her voice hoarse, continued to narrate the tale of the fox and the bear, the words slipping like water over smooth stones, filling the predatory silence of the log cabin. It wasn't just a story for her grandchildren, but an ancient melody, a tenuous thread of hope she wove into the dense air, trying to bridge humanity and primordial savagery. Every syllable was a prayer, a silent challenge, an affirmation of her presence. Semyon and Lena, though still trembling, seemed to find a fragile refuge in their grandmother's familiar rhythm. Their small bodies, pressed against her legs, vibrated with fear, but Akulina's voice was a beacon, a point of light in the oppressive darkness. The amber eyes of the tigers, hundreds of them, dotted the gloom, some motionless as embers, others blinking slowly as if absorbing every sound, every emotion. The leader's bluish eyes, however, didn't stray from Akulina's. She felt that the story, however much she tried, wasn't the language it sought. There was a depth in those eyes that demanded more than mere human words. It demanded recognition, a form of communication that transcended the species barrier, something rooted in the earth, in blood, in ancestral memory. The hunger she sensed wasn't for meat, but for an understanding she didn't yet possess. The old woman took a deep breath, the scent of musk and snow invading her lungs. She released the snow shovel, which fell with a soft thud onto the wooden floor. It wasn't a surrender, but a gesture, an invitation. Her wrinkled fingers fumbled at her neck, finding the mammoth bone amulet she had worn since youth, a gift from her father, engraved with her clan's symbols of protection. With her eyes still fixed on those of the tiger leader, Akulina began to sing. It wasn't a lullaby, nor a tale. It was an algiz, a shamanic chant of invocation and respect, passed down through generations, an echo of the voices of her ancestors who revered the spirits of the tiger. Her voice, initially a hoarse whisper, gained strength and resonance, filling the log cabin with deep, melodic tones that seemed to vibrate in the very logs of the dwelling. The words, in ancient YAKUT, spoke of the vastness of the forest, the strength of the bear spirit, the cunning of the fox, the patience of the wolf. But above all, they spoke of the great tiger, the invisible master, the guardian spirit of the icy lands, the Bai-Bayanai of felines, to whom respect and offering were due. She didn't ask for mercy, but for understanding. She didn't beg for salvation, but for a truce, a mutual recognition of existence. As Akulina sang, the tigers in the gloom became more motionless. No growl echoed. No claw scrape broke the rhythm of the chant. Even the leader, whose blue eyes didn't stray, seemed to absorb every note, every vibration of the old woman's voice. Its flanks rose and fell in slow, deep breaths, the image of primordial patience. Semyon and Lena, pressed against her, felt the trembling subside. The fear hadn't vanished, but Akulina's voice, charged with an ancestral force, was a more potent shield than any wooden wall. They didn't understand the words, but they felt the magic, the gravity of the moment. When the algiz came to an end, an even deeper silence fell upon the log cabin, heavy and expectant. Akulina didn't break eye contact with the leader. There was a silent question in its eyes, a plea for a non-violent response. The tiger leader, after a long instant that felt like an eternity, moved. It didn't advance nor retreat. Instead, it slowly lowered its head, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that to Akulina seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 years. Its blue eyes, previously fixed and inquisitive, softened slightly, a glint of something the old woman dared not name. And then a sound, not a growl nor a purr, but a deep, resonant breath that vibrated in the air like wind passing through an ice cave. It wasn't a threat. It was an answer An answer Akulina needed to decipher, a new layer in the enigma surrounding them. The night, she knew, was only beginning to reveal its darkest and most ancient secrets. The resonant sound of the tiger leader vibrated through the logs of the cabin, a deep note that seemed to echo not only in the air, but in the depths of the frozen earth. It wasn't a hunting roar, nor the purr of a satisfied feline, but something more primordial, a communication that transcended human language. Akulina felt the vibration in her chest, a shiver that didn't come from the cold, but from the proximity to an ancestral power. Her eyes remained fixed on the tiger's blue eyes, seeking the key to that sonic enigma. The lowering of the animal's head, the momentary softness in its gaze. Akulina absorbed all of it, filtering it through the lens of her ancient wisdom. It wasn't a gesture of submission, but of recognition. A respectful challenge. The deep breath, she realized, was the acceptance of her algies, a response to the invocation, but also a declaration of its own unwavering presence. The tiger didn't ask, it affirmed. It didn't attack, it observed. And what it observed, Akulina felt, was the essence of her soul, her connection to the land they both inhabited. A subtle movement in the gloom caught her attention, not from the leader, but from one of the tigers closest to the wall. A female, Akulina noted by her more slender form and slightly rounder eyes. She sat down, raising a front paw and licking it with an almost hypnotic slowness. Was it an act of indifference or of trust? Akulina couldn't decipher. The other tigers, hundreds of them, continued to dot the darkness, their silent presences a constant pressure. Semyon and Lena, still clinging to her legs, felt the change in atmosphere. The raw terror that had paralyzed them began to give way to a silent confusion. They didn't understand what was happening, but the absence of an attack, their grandmother's calm voice, and the strange stillness of the predators gave them a fragile respite. Lena lifted her head, her large, moist eyes fixed on the leader. Akulina knew she needed to go beyond the chant. The tiger had responded to respect. Now she needed a bridge. Her wrinkled fingers released the mammoth bone amulet which hung from her neck. She slowly brought her hand to her belt, where she kept a small hunting knife, its reindeer horn handle polished smooth from use. It wasn't a weapon for the tiger, but a symbol of her own ability to provide, of her connection to the hunt and survival. With a deliberate movement, Akulina drew the knife and placed it on the wooden floor between herself and the leader. The metallic sound of the blade against the floor was the only noise to break the heavy silence. It was an offering, a gesture of trust, but also an affirmation. She was a hunter, a provider, not a helpless prey. The knife, though useless against 1,000 tigers, was a piece of her soul, her essence as a survivor. The leader's blue eyes followed the movement, fixing on the knife for an instant, before returning to Akulina's eyes. The old woman felt that the tiger was weighing the gesture, assessing its meaning. The hunger in its eyes, she realized with icy clarity, wasn't for blood or meat. It was a hunger for balance, for a recognition of boundaries, of ancient laws that had been forgotten. A tremor ran through the log cabin, not a tremor of fear, but a shudder coming from outside, as if the earth itself were moving. The sound was distant, yet deep, a kind of lament that seemed to come from the heart of the tiger. The tigers, previously motionless, tensed. Their muscles rippled under their fur, and some let out low, guttural growls, not directed at Akulina, but at the source of the external sound. The tiger leader raised its head, its blue eyes now piercing the cabin wall, as if it could see through the thick logs. There was an urgency in its expression, a shadow of concern Akulina would never expect to see in such a powerful predator. That distant lament, she realized, was the true reason for the invasion. It wasn't her the tigers sought, but refuge, or perhaps an answer to a greater threat approaching across the icy plains. The night was truly revealing its secrets, and they were more complex and terrifying than Akulina had ever imagined. The tigers weren't the only monsters in the darkness. Whatever was out there was powerful enough to frighten 1,000 Siberian tigers. And Akulina, with her grandchildren and her knife on the floor, was at the center of this impending storm. She needed to decipher not only the tiger's will, but the nature of the threat that had driven them to her door. A respectful challenge. The lament outside intensified. It wasn't a roar, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the frozen earth and rose through the ancient logs of the cabin. Akulina felt it in her bones, a cold tremor that had nothing to do with the Siberian winter. The sound was ancient, a primordial wail that spoke of immense pain or unimaginable power. The tigress closest to the wall, who had been licking herself, froze mid-movement, her ears swiveling towards the source of the sound. Her tail lashed once, sharply against the wooden floor. The hundreds of amber eyes in the gloom now gleamed with raw, desperate fear. The low growls that had been directed outwards intensified, becoming a chorus of guttural warnings. These were not the sounds of predators contemplating a meal, but of creatures sensing a threat far beyond their capacity to master. The tiger leader, its blue eyes still fixed on Akulina for a fleeting instant, then shifted its gaze to the wall. Its nostrils flared, testing the air for an invisible terror. A low, rumbling growl emanated from its chest, a sound of deep unease, echoing the distant lament. Semyon and Lena, who had found a fragile calm in Akulina's song, now whimpered again. The distant sound was too alien, too vast for their young minds to comprehend, but its terror seeped into them. Lena buried her face deeper into Akulina's leg, her small body trembling uncontrollably. Semyon, usually the bolder one, clung to his grandmother's fur coat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Akulina's mind raced, sifting through generations of legends, tales whispered by campfires under the aurora borealis. The algaes had spoken of tiger spirits, of ancient forces that maintained balance. This lament was a disturbance, a tear in the fabric of that balance. It was the sound of something vast, perhaps elemental, awakened or enraged. The log cabin itself groaned, the ice crystals on the windows vibrating visibly, a fine dust of snow falling from the crevices in the ceiling logs. The air grew colder, not just the biting cold of winter, but a penetrating chill that felt unnatural, as if the very warmth of life were being sucked from the room. The tiger leader took a step forward, not towards Akulina, but past her, towards the door, and then stopped. Its head swiveled back, its blue eyes meeting Akulina's. There was a desperate plea there, a shared understanding that transcended species. It was a silent question. Do you know what this is? Can you help? Akulina understood. The tigers had sought refuge not from her, but from this. And now they were trapped together. Her gaze fell upon the hunting knife on the floor, still gleaming faintly in the scarce light. She had offered it as a symbol of trust, of her role as provider. Now it seemed inadequate. This new threat wasn't something one could hunt or kill with a blade. With slow, deliberate movements, Akulina bent down and picked up the knife. Its cold handle felt solid in her hand. She didn't sheath it, but held it openly, the blade pointed downwards. This wasn't a weapon against the tigers, nor against the invisible terror. It was an extension of her will, a declaration of her resolve. The lament outside swelled closer now, a chorus of deep, mournful tones that seemed to tear the very fabric of silence. The log cabin shuddered violently, a crack appearing in one of the thick window panes, spreading like a spiderweb across the ice. The tigers pressed against the walls, their bodies low, their eyes wide with undisguised terror. They were cornered, and Akulina was with them. The leader let out a soft, almost pleading whimper, a sound utterly different from the dominant growl she had heard before. It looked at Akulina, then at the door, and then back at her. The message was clear. We are trapped. We need to act. Akulina knew that the time for ancient songs of respect was over. This was a battle for survival, not just for her family, but for these majestic beasts and perhaps for the very spirit of the tiger. She looked at her trembling grandchildren, then at the terrified eyes of the predators surrounding them. The line between human and animal, hunter and hunted, had blurred into an urgent, shared vulnerability. She had to find a way to navigate this new and terrifying reality. The true test of her ancestral wisdom had only just begun, and the night was far from over. Akulina's mind, sharp as the blade she now held, processed the urgency in the tiger's gaze. There was no more time for offerings or songs of respect. The threat outside wasn't a predator to be appeased, but a force seeking imbalance, and the log cabin was now a ship adrift in an elemental storm. The lament grew, not in volume but in density, as if the very air were thickening with an ancient, powerful sorrow. The crack in the windowpane, previously a fine web, expanded with a dry snap, and small fragments of ice fell onto the wooden floor. An icy, unnatural breath seeped through the gap, carrying with it a smell of wet earth and something rotten, like roots exposed to the cold of death. Akulina's grandchildren, Semyon and Lena, let out a muffled cry, their bodies huddled in a trembling mass against their grandmother's legs. Akulina didn't look at them. Her eyes were fixed on the tiger leader. It had taken a step back, its body tense, its back muscles twitching. Its blue eyes, previously filled with respectful challenge, now reflected an almost human anxiety. The chorus of growls and whimpers from the other tigers grew more frantic, a sound of collective panic filling the space. They huddled together, some scratching the walls with their claws, as if trying to dig a way away from that penetrating sound. "We don't run," Akulina murmured, her voice hoarse, not to the tiger, but to herself, a declaration of her own resistance. "We face it." With the hunting knife held firmly in her hand, she took a step forward. Moving away from her grandchildren, the tiger leader retreated a little further, opening a path. It wasn't fear of her, but a recognition of her determination. Akulina stopped before the cracked window, her wrinkled fingers brushing the cold wood of the frame. The lament seemed to concentrate there, as if the invisible force were testing the weakest point of the defense. She raised the knife, not to attack, but to trace an ancient symbol in the air, a gesture her grandmother had taught her to ward off evil spirits of the tiger. It was a circle with a central point, a reminder of unity and balance. As she traced it, her lips moved in a whisper, a silent prayer to the protective spirits of the earth. The lament outside seemed to falter for an instant, as if the force had been momentarily distracted or confused by the gesture. But then it returned with redoubled fury. The log cabin shuddered again, and this time a larger piece of ice broke free from the window, falling with a clatter onto the floor. The cold, putrid air invaded the room with greater intensity, making the tigers cower and let out low whimpers. The tiger leader, who had been observing Akulina's every move, took a step sideways. And then, to the old woman's surprise, it turned and addressed one of the tigers closest to the door, a huge male with a scarred eye. It let out a low, imperative growl, and the other tiger reluctantly began to push its massive body against the door, reinforcing it. Akulina understood. The tiger wasn't asking her to physically fight the lament. It was asking her to use her wisdom, while they, the tigers, would use their brute strength to protect the refuge. A tacit alliance had been forged, not by words but by necessity and shared terror. She looked at the leader, an almost imperceptible nod exchanged between them. It was the strength, she was the mind. But Akulina's mind still struggled to decipher the exact nature of the threat. The lament wasn't from an animal, nor a spirit she knew. It was something deeper, more fundamental. She needed more light, more clarity to see what was happening outside, to understand what was disturbing the balance of the tiger, enough to frighten 1,000 tigers. Her eyes swept the room, searching for a source of light, something that could pierce the darkness and reveal the face of the approaching terror. The old oil lamp, hanging near the door, swayed precariously, its weak flame barely illuminating the chaos. Akulina knew she needed to light it, or find another source of light before the darkness became her greatest enemy. The night was still young, and the real battle was just beginning. Akulina's eyes swept the room, assessing the distance and the danger. The lamp was high, out of reach for her wrinkled hands, especially with the unstable floor beneath her feet. The tigers, obeying their leader's silent command, continued to press their bodies against the door, their muscles tense and their low growls a constant chorus of alert. They formed a living barrier, imposing and dangerous, between Akulina and her objective, but necessity was greater than fear. The lament outside intensified, a sound that seemed to corrode the very structure of the log cabin. More dry snaps resonated from the windows, and a gust of icy, fetid air invaded the room, making the lamp's flame flicker dangerously, threatening to extinguish. Semyon and Lena let out a whimper, clutching each other, their small faces pale with terror. Akulina tightened her grip on the hunting knife. It wasn't a weapon, but a tool, an extension of her will. With slow, deliberate steps, she moved towards the door, navigating among the massive bodies of the tigers. Each beast was a coiled spring of tension, its fur bristling, its eyes fixed on the door or windows. As Akulina approached, the tiger leader who was closest to the lamp raised its head, its blue eyes meeting hers. There was no threat in its gaze, only a grim understanding and a sudden stillness in its movements, as if it recognized the urgency of her mission. It moved slightly to the side, opening a small space. Akulina didn't hesitate. She extended the knife. The blade pointed upwards, and with its tip carefully hooked the lamp's metal ring. The lamp's weight was minimal, but the building's trembling made the task difficult. A thin layer of ice dust fell from the ceiling onto her head as she slowly pulled the lamp down, with the precision of someone who had lived a lifetime of manual labor. With a sigh of relief, she held it in her hands, the small flame flickering, almost dying out. Her wrinkled, calloused fingers adjusted the wick, and the fire, like a stubborn spirit, gained strength, casting a trembling orange light over the room. The darkness receded, clearly revealing the scene of terror. Her grandchildren's wide eyes, the tigers' tense bodies, the panic scratches on the log walls, and the cracks that now snaked across all the window panes like frozen veins. But the light also revealed something more. Through the largest crack in the nearest window, the one that had spread like a spiderweb, Akulina managed to glimpse a shadow. It wasn't the shadow of an animal, nor of a tree swaying in the wind. It was a dark, shapeless mass, moving with agonizing slowness, almost as if dragging itself through the snow. The smell of wet, rotten earth, previously subtle, was now unmistakable, impregnating the air with a nauseating density. The lament outside, now closer and more distinct, wasn't just a sound of sadness, but a chorus of deep guttural voices, as if the earth itself were weeping. Akulina felt a chill that didn't come from the external cold, but from a terrifying recognition. She had heard ancient tales of the Abasi, the evil spirits of the underworld, but this was different, older, more elemental. The dark mass outside seemed to absorb the lamp's faint light, becoming even more opaque. A piece of ice the size of Akulina's hand broke free from the window with a loud snap, falling inside the log cabin. Through the newly formed hole, the wind howled, bringing with it not only the putrid smell, but also a hissing sound, almost a whisper, that seemed to call to them. The tigers retreated further, some letting out frightened whimpers, their bodies shrinking as much as possible against the walls. The leader, however, maintained its position near the door, its blue eyes fixed on the exterior darkness, then returning to Akulina, a glint of desperation and a sudden urgency in its gaze. It wasn't asking for help to fight, but to understand. Akulina knew. This wasn't a beast to be hunted. It was the very essence of imbalance, an open wound in the heart of the tiger, and it was coming for them. The lamp in her hand trembled, but her determination did not. She needed to protect her grandchildren. And somehow, now also, these beasts who had become her companions in misfortune. Whatever was out there, it was an enemy of all that lived, and the log cabin was the last bastion of hope against a darkness that threatened to swallow the world. Akulina felt the entity's putrid cold invade her lungs, a sensation that seemed to freeze not just the flesh, but the very soul. It wasn't the usual cold of Yakutia, but a chill of emptiness, of despair. Her eyes, accustomed to deciphering the tiger's signs, now tried to read the memories of a lifetime, seeking an echo, a warning in forgotten tales. The dark mass outside, visible through the widened crack, had no definite form, but its presence was overwhelming, an invisible weight pressing against the cabin walls. The chorus of guttural voices transformed into a more articulate, though unintelligible lament, like words whispered in an ancient forgotten tongue filled with a primordial pain. Semyon and Lena, huddled, let out small cries of dread with each snap from the windows. More pieces of ice broke free, and the air inside the cabin grew increasingly dense with the smell of wet, rotten earth, an odor that spoke of death and decay, but of something that had never truly lived. The tigers, previously a wall of brute force, now trembled. Their growls became low, continuous whimpers, a song of panic that mingled with the external lament. The leader, however, remained firm. It turned to Akulina, its blue eyes reflecting the flickering light of the lamp, and in its gaze, Akulina saw not just fear, but a silent question about what they would do next. The old woman took a deep breath, drawing in the icy, fetid air. Her thoughts raced like rivers melting in spring, seeking the source of a wisdom that could confront such an abomination. Memories of her grandmother, of stories told by firelight surfaced, tales of the Yoryak, the earth spirits, and Ulu Toyon, the great master of the underworld, who sometimes manifested in shapeless forms when balance was broken. But this was different. It wasn't a spirit with will, but a manifestation of a wound, the very pain of the earth materializing. She remembered an ancient song, a melody her grandmother sang to calm the tiger during the most violent storms, not to ward off evil, but to bring back balance. A song that spoke of the interconnectedness of everything, of cold and warmth, of life and death, of sky and earth. It was a song of harmony, a prayer for the world to find its center again. Akulina knew she couldn't fight it with the knife. She couldn't shout or threaten. The only weapon she possessed was her voice, her connection to the earth and her ancestors. She needed to try to restore balance, even if only within the log cabin, to create a sanctuary of hope against the encroaching darkness. Her eyes fixed on the crack in the window. The dark mass seemed to pulse outside, and the hissing whisper grew clearer, as if trying to communicate or perhaps to call. "No, don't call me," Akulina murmured, her voice hoarse but firm. "I will not come to you." She turned to her grandchildren, their faces pale and eyes wide. "Semyon, Lena," she said, her voice soft, but with an authority that made them stop trembling for an instant. "Come closer. Sing with me." The children looked at her, confused. Sing? While the world outside was falling apart. "It's an ancient song," Akulina explained, her voice a little louder to be heard above the external lament, which now seemed to want to pierce their ears. "A song for balance, for Mother Earth." She sat on the wooden floor, the lamp beside her, casting dancing shadows. The tiger leader, observing, let out a low growl, not of warning but of strange expectation. It seemed to understand that Akulina's attack would be of a different nature. Akulina began to sing. Her voice, once strong and clear, was now a tenuous thread, but it carried the strength of generations. The words were ancient, spoken in a dialect few still knew, describing the beauty of the tiger, the strength of the ice, the resilience of life. It was a simple, repetitive melody, yet filled with a deep reverence for nature. At first, her grandchildren merely watched her, petrified. The lament outside seemed to hesitate for an instant, as if Akulina's song were a strange noise in its cacophony of pain. But then it returned with redoubled fury, and the cracks in the windows deepened with a sound of breaking glass. Small shards fell, and the putrid smell intensified. Akulina didn't stop. She closed her eyes, concentrating all her energy on the words, on the melody. She wasn't trying to ward off the darkness, but rather to reinforce the light within them, within the log cabin. She was weaving a barrier of harmony. Semyon, the elder, hesitated for a moment, then with a trembling voice, began to imitate his grandmother's notes. Lena, seeing her brother, joined them, her small voice an almost inaudible whisper. Three voices, fragile against the fury of the outside world, began to intertwine. Gradually, the song gained a strange strength. It didn't diminish the lament outside, which continued to howl and whisper, but it created a point of resistance, a center of calm, in the eye of the storm. The tigers, who had previously trembled, now seemed to calm slightly, their bodies still tense, but their eyes fixed on the old woman and her grandchildren, as if the melody were an anchor for their own sanity. Akulina opened her eyes. The dark mass outside was still there, pulsing, but the song had created a kind of veil, an invisible barrier that, though it didn't repel it, prevented it from advancing with the same ease. She felt a pang of exhaustion, but also a spark of hope. It wasn't a victory, but a reprieve. The log cabin was still vulnerable, but for a moment the harmony of her voice had defied the imbalance. What would come next she didn't know, but the song had rekindled an old flame in her heart. The true battle, she realized, wasn't one of strength but of spirit, and she was only just beginning to fight. Akulina's song, a tenuous thread of ancestral melody, continued to weave itself into the icy air of the log cabin, a fragile barrier against the howling lament coming from outside. Semyon and Lena, their childish voices mixed with their grandmother's, created a chorus of resistance, a small point of light in the oppressive darkness. Outside, the shapeless mass pulsed with renewed fury, as if the harmony of the song were an aggressor, not an appeal. The smell of wet, rotten earth intensified, suffocating the air with its nauseating density. The cracks in the windows, previously thin as frozen veins, now deepened with dry, alarming snaps. A sound of breaking glass echoed through the cabin, and a larger piece of the nearest window detached, falling with a clatter onto the wooden floor. Through the newly formed hole, the wind howled with brutal force, bringing with it not only the biting cold of Yakutia, but also the entity's chill of emptiness, which seemed to creep inside, an invisible tendril of despair. The hissing whisper grew clearer, almost a voice, calling, inviting, promising an end. The tigers, who had calmed slightly with the melody, now growled softly, their bodies shrinking even further. The leader, however, kept its blue eyes fixed on Akulina, its posture tense, but with an intelligence that went beyond instinct. It wasn't just afraid, it was observing, waiting. Akulina felt the putrid cold invade her lungs, a sensation that seemed to freeze not just the flesh, but the very soul. The song was a shield, she knew, but not a weapon. It couldn't repel the emptiness, only contain it. The log cabin was bleeding, and the blood was the warmth and hope the entity yearned to consume. She needed to seal the wound. An ancient memory, a flash of her grandmother bent over a flickering fire, surfaced. It wasn't a song to ward off, but a ritual to bind, to anchor life to the earth. Her grandmother spoke of the hearth smoke, the power of ash, the essence of fire that purifies and protects, that links the world of the living to the ancestral world, creating an impenetrable barrier for those who wander between formless realms. The entity outside wasn't a spirit with will, but a wound, and wounds need to be closed, cauterized. "Semyon, Lena," Akulina said, her voice hoarse, but with a new urgency. She didn't stop singing, but the words became faster, more focused. "We need fire, fire and ashes from the hearth." Semyon the elder, his eyes wide, but with a spark of understanding, nodded. He crawled to the stone fireplace in the corner of the cabin, where dying embers still emitted a faint warmth. Lena, still singing softly, clung to her grandmother's skirt. "Get a piece of dry wood, Semyon," Akulina instructed, pointing to a pile of firewood beside the fireplace, "and some ash, quick." The boy, with surprising agility for his fear, picked up a small stick and with trembling hands gathered a handful of cold ashes. Akulina, still singing, took the trembling lamp from her hand. The small flame, the same one she had lit with such effort, was now the key to salvation. With a swift movement, she took a piece of old cloth and wrapped it around the end of Semyon's stick, creating an improvised torch. Carefully, she touched the wick to the lamp's flame. The cloth caught fire with a soft crackle, and a small flame danced at the stick's tip. "Now, the ashes," Akulina requested, and Semyon poured them over the torch. The smoke, dense and fragrant with the smell of burning wood, began to rise, mingling with the entity's putrid air. Akulina stood, the improvised torch in one hand, the lamp in the other, her eyes fixed on the hole in the window. The lament outside intensified, as if the smoke were poison to the entity. The dark mass outside seemed to recede slightly, its hissing whisper transforming into a hiss of repulsion. With renewed determination, Akulina began to intone a new part of the song, words that spoke of the fire's strength, the smoke's purification, the connection to the earth and the ancestors. She approached the hole in the window, the torch's warmth contrasting with the putrid cold that seeped in. The tiger leader, as if understanding the ritual, let out a low growl and positioned itself between Akulina and the other tigers, creating a protective barrier. It wasn't fighting the entity, but protecting the sanctuary Akulina was trying to create. Akulina, with the smoldering torch, began to draw ancient symbols in the air in front of the hole, using the smoke as ink. The ashes, mixed with the fire, seemed to dance, creating a grey veil that extended outwards. With each symbol, the entity's hiss grew louder, and the dark mass outside receded a little further, as if the smoke were a physical barrier, an invisible wall of protection. Akulina's, Semyon's and Lena's song grew stronger, their voices mingling with the smoke and the entity's hiss. The putrid smell diminished slightly, replaced by the smoky aroma of burning wood. The chill of emptiness was still there, but no longer invading with the same intensity. It was as if the smoke had created a kind of seal, a dressing for the wound in the log cabin. Akulina felt a deep exhaustion, but also a sense of momentary victory. The entity hadn't vanished, but had been contained, its physical invasion prevented. The hole in the window was still there, but now guarded by a veil of smoke and ancestral intent. The battle was one of spirit, and she had found a new way to fight, one that united the physical with the ethereal. The log cabin was safe for now, but Akulina knew that the darkness wouldn't give up so easily. The night was still long, and the entity, though repelled, still lurked in the icy shadows of Yakutia. Akulina felt her knees buckle. The improvised torch, now just a charred stick, fell from her hand, hitting the wooden floor with a dull thud. Smoke still danced in the air, a grey veil mingling with the pungent smell of burnt wood, overlaying the entity's sickly sweet and putrid stench. Her lungs burned from the effort of the song and the smoke inhalation, and her throat was dry and sore. Semyon and Lena, their faces pale and eyes wide, stopped singing, their small, hoarse voices silenced by exhaustion and momentary relief. The hole in the window, once an open wound through which emptiness tried to seep, now seemed guarded by a dense mist. The entity's hiss outside diminished, transforming into an irritated whisper, a sound of claws scratching an invisible surface. It hadn't fully retreated, Akulina knew, only been contained. Like a temporarily caged beast, the chill still radiated from the hole, but the more aggressive invasion had ceased. The tiger leader, who had observed the entire ritual with an almost human intensity, let out a deep sigh, a grave sound that reverberated through the cabin. It slightly relaxed its posture, but its blue eyes remained fixed on the window and then on Akulina, as if awaiting her next command. The other tigers, previously huddled, began to move with more freedom, some lying on the cold floor, others sniffing the air with curiosity. Their presence, once an imminent threat, now seemed almost protective. Akulina sat down heavily, leaning against the wooden wall. The lamp, which she had held so tightly, trembled faintly in her hand, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows. She looked at Semyon and Lena. Her grandchildren were exhausted, but the spark of fear in their eyes had diminished, replaced by a glint of admiration and renewed trust. They had sung, they had helped, they had fought. "It's not over yet," Akulina whispered, her voice almost inaudible, "but we've bought some time." Time, however, was a luxury the log cabin could ill afford. The icy wind of Yakutia still penetrated through the hole in the window, and the cold, though no longer accompanied by the entity's putrid presence, was biting. The temperature inside the cabin began to drop rapidly, threatening the fragile bodies of the children and Akulina herself. The ritual smoke, though protective, offered no warmth. The window, "Babushka," Semyon said, his voice a little firmer now. "It's broken." Akulina nodded. She needed to close the physical wound, not just the spiritual one. But how? There were no more loose planks, and the broken glass couldn't be mended. The remaining wood was for the fire, to warm the cabin, not to seal an opening. Her eyes scanned the cabin, searching for a solution. The tiger leader's gaze followed hers, its blue eyes gleaming in the gloom. It seemed to understand the urgency, the necessity. Suddenly, one of the smaller tigers, a young one with lighter stripes, rose and approached the broken window. It sniffed the cold air entering, let out a low growl, and then, with a surprising movement, rubbed its flank against the opening, as if trying to block it with its own furry body. Akulina watched, perplexed. It was an instinctive gesture, perhaps, but there also seemed to be an intention behind it. The tiger's thick fur offered some protection against the wind, but it wasn't enough to seal the hole. Nevertheless, it gave Akulina an idea. "The blankets," she said, pointing to a pile of old furs and blankets in the corner. "We need to cover the window. Semyon, Lena, help." With a new purpose, the children rose, their small hands grabbing the heavy blankets. The tiger leader, seeing the movement, let out a soft roar and pushed the young tiger aside, taking its place in front of the window itself. Its massive body, covered in dense fur, was a much more effective barrier. The other tigers, as if in a tacit agreement, joined it, creating a living wall of fur and muscle in front of the opening. Semyon and Lena, with Akulina's help, began to hang the blankets over the wall of tigers, trying to cover as much of the hole as possible. The furs were heavy and slippery, but the family's determination and the unexpected cooperation of the tigers gave them strength. Gradually, the icy wind subsided, and the internal temperature stopped dropping so abruptly. The entity's putrid smell, though still present, seemed even more distant, muffled by the barrier of blankets and the tigers' warm bodies. Akulina felt a wave of gratitude for the animals. They were no longer a threat, but unlikely allies, forced into a truce by the presence of a common enemy, a threat that transcended the food chain. She sat down again, her body aching with pain and exhaustion. The lamp continued to burn, its faint glow the only beacon in the oppressive darkness. The log cabin was patched, but not healed. The entity was still out there, lurking, waiting for a new weakness, a new hole to exploit. Akulina knew the truce was temporary and that the real fight was yet to come. The night was long, and the Ansvendiwandiksi cold was an enemy as relentless as the entity, an enemy that slowly consumed hope and life. She needed more than blankets and smoke. She needed a strategy to survive until dawn, to protect her grandchildren from a darkness that seemed to want to swallow the world itself. Akulina closed her eyes for an instant, feeling the weight of age and exhaustion crush her. The lamp in her hand still flickered, a stubborn point of light in the darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond the small circle it illuminated. Her grandchildren, Semyon and Lena, had huddled near the fireplace, their small bodies trembling slightly, not just from cold, but from the recent memory of terror. The silence, previously unthinkable, had returned to the log cabin, heavy and dense, punctuated only by the soft rustle of the wind outside and the deep snorting of the tigers. "It's not over yet," she had whispered. The truth of her words weighed on her heart. The smoke and blankets were a dressing, not a cure. The entity, though repelled, still lurked, a hungry shadow waiting. The cold, relentless, was a constant enemy, eroding the cabin's resistance and its occupants. Akulina needed more than mere palliatives. She observed the wall of tigers. Their massive, warm bodies formed an impressive barrier against the wind that still tried to seep through the crevices. The leader, with its piercing blue eyes, seemed to stand guard, its attention divided between the sealed window and the old woman. There was an intelligence there, a tacit understanding that transcended simple animal survival. They were there for a reason, united against an enemy that threatened them all. She needed warmth. The fireplace, fed with the last dry twigs, barely managed to combat the cold seeping through the wooden walls. Each piece of wood was precious, a promise of life. But what else did she have? Her gaze fell upon the bear and reindeer furs that lined the floor in places. They were insulating, yes, but couldn't be burned. Her late husband's hunting tools were useless against a spectral threat. Akulina closed her eyes again, searching her ancestral memory, the stories of winter, of battles against the cold and against forest spirits. The ancients always spoke of the importance of the heart of the home, of the fire that should never die, but they also spoke of the voice of the spirit, of the song that guided and protected. The entity had reacted to the smoke and the song. This meant it wasn't invincible, that it had weaknesses, the hiss of repulsion, the retreat. It was a creature of emptiness, of darkness. What opposed that? Light and life. The lamp was a symbol, the fire in the hearth was life, her grandchildren the hope of the future. But what else? Yakutia was a place of extremes. What did nature offer to combat cold and evil? She remembered an ancient legend told by her own grandmother about how shamans protected villages from evil spirits during the longest winter nights. It wasn't just smoke, but the essence of the forest, the herbs and resins that, when burned, purified the air and strengthened the spirit. Akulina opened her eyes. Her grandchildren slept deeply, their childish faces illuminated by the flickering light of the lamp. The tiger leader let out a low growl, almost inaudible, as if sensing the awakening of a new determination in the old woman. She rose with difficulty, feeling every muscle protest. Her eyes scanned the interior of the cabin. There was a small leather pouch hanging from one of the support pillars, forgotten for years. It contained her grandmother's last herbs, kept for healing and protection rituals. She had forgotten them, thinking they would never be needed again. With trembling hands, Akulina took the pouch. The scent of dried herbs and ancient resins filled the air, an earthy, pungent aroma that contrasted with the entity's stale odor. She took a handful of herbs and carefully tossed them onto the dying embers in the fireplace. A sweet and spicy aroma rose, mingling with the wood smoke. It wasn't the dense smoke of the previous ritual, but an aromatic, almost ethereal mist. The hiss outside, which had diminished to a whisper, seemed to intensify again, but this time with a note of fury, not pure repulsion. The entity disliked it. Akulina smiled, a tired but determined smile. "Light and life," she murmured, "and the strength of the earth." She needed to keep the fire burning, to nurture the light, but she also needed more than that. The night was still long. With each hour, the cold deepened, and the entity's patience wore thin. She looked at the tiger leader. Its blue eyes met hers. There was a silent question there. "You understand," Akulina said, her voice hoarse. "It's not just the cold. It's the darkness that wants to steal our light." The tiger let out a low sound, a guttural murmur that seemed to echo understanding. Akulina knew that the next step wouldn't be merely defensive. She needed a way to fight, to attack the very essence of the entity, to banish it for good. But how? She sat down again, the herbs burning in the fireplace, the aromatic smoke filling the cabin. The warmth of the tigers, the light of the lamp, the scent of the herbs, all of it was life, resistance. But the entity was persistent. She needed a plan that didn't rely merely on repelling, but on banishing, a plan that utilized what she had, her wisdom, her grandchildren's courage, and the unexpected strength of her feline allies. Dawn seemed a distant mirage, but Akulina knew she couldn't give up. The lives of her grandchildren, the hope of her clan, depended on her ability to find a way to kindle a flame that could burn away darkness itself. Akulina felt the weight of that truth in her bones, heavier than the cold. The herbs in the fireplace crackled softly, releasing their protective scent. But the hiss outside didn't cease, only shifted in tone, from repulsion to furious impatience. The entity wouldn't simply be dissuaded. It demanded to be banished. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, swept the cabin once more, searching not for an object, but for a memory, an echo of ancestral wisdom that could guide her. She remembered her grandmother's stories, told on long winter nights, about the Abazi, the evil spirits that fed on despair and emptiness. It wasn't enough to light a fire or chant a song. It was necessary to invoke the very essence of life, the primordial force of the earth and the ancestors, to expel that which had no form but had hunger. The answer wasn't in wood for the fire, nor in furs for warmth, but in something that had been forgotten, kept for a time no one expected to arrive. Her gaze fell on a dark corner above an old chest covered by a dusty blanket. There, hanging on a rusty hook, was a small tur, a shamanic hand drum made of deer hide and larch wood. It was her great-grandfather's drum, a respected healer, which had been silenced for decades, a mere forgotten adornment. A shiver ran through Akulina, not from cold, but from recognition. The tur was the voice of the spirits, the link between the visible and invisible worlds. It was the song that guided and protected, but in a much deeper way than a mere murmur. It was the pulsating heart of her lineage, a flame that could be kindled not with fire, but with sound and intention. Outside, the entity's hiss gained volume, transforming into a scratching whisper that seemed to seep through the wooden walls, laden with a chill that made the tiger's fur bristle. One of the felines, the leader, let out a deep growl, a sound that vibrated through the cabin's wood, a warning. The other tigers, who formed the living barrier against the window, shifted restlessly, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, fixed on the door, as if expecting an imminent attack. Semyon, who had been lightly sleeping near the fireplace, opened his eyes abruptly. His gaze met Akulina's, a mixture of fear and childlike trust. Lena, even younger, pressed herself against her brother, her small body trembling. "Babushka?" Semyon whispered, his voice laden with apprehension. Akulina rose, the pain in her joints a constant reminder of age, but her determination was unshakable. "It's time, my little one," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "It's time to kindle the flame that burns away darkness." She walked slowly to the corner where the tuer hung. Her wrinkled fingers touched the dried hide of the drum, feeling the texture of history, of memory. There was a small wooden beater, also forgotten, attached to the side of the drum with a leather cord. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in her hand. As Akulina unhooked the drum, the cabin seemed to groan. A scraping sound, like giant claws raking wood, came from outside, from the direction of the main door. The air inside the log cabin grew denser, colder, and the entity's putrid smell intensified, suffocating. The lamp in Akulina's hand flickered, its flame almost dying out, as if the very light were being sucked away. The tiger leader, in front of the window, turned its head sharply towards the door, letting out a deep roar that made the other tigers flinch slightly, but also made them brace themselves. They knew the entity was approaching. Akulina didn't hesitate. She turned to Semyon and Lena, her blue eyes gleaming with an intensity her grandchildren had never seen. "Semyon, Lena," she said, her voice strong, "you need to be brave, braver than ever." She extended the drum to Semyon. "Hold this, keep it steady, and you, Lena," she pointed to the lamp, which still stubbornly gleamed, "keep the light burning. Don't let it go out." With wide eyes, Semyon took the drum, his small hands barely managing to hold it. Lena clutched the lamp, pressing it against her chest, as if her own strength could keep the flame alive. Akulina took the drum beater and knelt near the fireplace, where the herbs still smoldered. She took another handful, this time of a different, darker mixture, and tossed them onto the embers. A thick, aromatic smoke rose, laden with a strong scent of resin and wet earth. The hiss outside transformed into a sharp wail, a sound of mixed pain and fury. The entity was reacting with violence. Akulina closed her eyes for an instant, breathing deeply the smoke of the herbs. She felt the ancestral energy flow through her, a warm current that combated the cold enveloping her. The flame she needed to kindle wouldn't be of wood, but of spirit, and the tour would be her guide. She took the drum from Semyon's hands, who watched her with a mixture of dread and fascination. With the beater in her hand, Akulina prepared herself. The night was long, but dawn, she knew, would come, and darkness, no matter how deep, couldn't last forever. She raised the beater. The first strike on the drum was about to resonate, a sound that would defy the emptiness, a sound that would summon life itself to fight against death. Akulina raised the beater. Her hand came down with surprising force for her 96 years. A deep, resonant thrum vibrated through the cabin, a sound Semyon and Lena had never heard. It wasn't the sound of wood hitting hide, but an ancestral pulse, a heart beating at the center of the world. The lamp's flame trembled violently in Lena's hands, but, defiantly, it did not go out. Outside, the entity's sharp wail transformed into a piercing roar, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night. The icy air in the cabin grew even denser, and the wooden walls groaned, as if about to give way under an invisible pressure. A dry snap reverberated from the main door, as if something heavy and unseen had crashed against it. The tigers, previously restless, now stiffened, their low, continuous growls mingling with the rhythm Akulina began to establish. The leader, its blue eyes fixed on the door, let out a deep roar, that made the wood vibrate, a sound that seemed to defy darkness itself. They positioned themselves, every muscle tense, forming a living barrier against the invisible assault. Akulina closed her eyes again, the beater moving with instinctive precision. The rhythm she created was irregular at first, hesitant, like a heart awakening from deep slumber, but soon found its own cadence. A rhythmic heartbeat filled the space, pushing back the cold and darkness with each strike. Semyon, with the drum resting on Akulina's legs, felt the vibration through his body, a strange mixture of fear and a sense of primordial power. Lena, clutching the lamp against her chest, watched her grandmother, her childish eyes reflecting the dancing flames. The scent of burning herbs was stronger now, an aromatic shield against the icy stench that tried to invade every crevice. The entity wouldn't retreat easily. A howling wind, colder than the air outside, seemed to materialize inside the cabin, making the few flames dance dangerously. The floorboards creaked, and the roof emitted a prolonged groan, as if the log cabin were under direct physical attack. The cold became a sharp pain, penetrating furs and clothes, trying to freeze hope in the hearts of the occupants. The tiger leader advanced a step, its body tense, ready for whatever came. The other felines matched its movement, forming a wall of muscle and protective fury, their eyes gleaming with a ferocity that wasn't wild, but determined. They weren't just animals, they were guardians, unexpected allies in an ancestral struggle. Akulina opened her eyes, her deep blue ones fixed on the door, where the entity's pressure seemed strongest. She intensified the rhythm, the drum's sound, now a call, a prayer, a challenge. Each beat was a pulse of life, an explosion of energy that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the earth. She wasn't just playing a drum, she was weaving a barrier of sound and spirit, a song of resistance. Semyon, sensing his grandmother's unshakable determination, placed his small hands on the drum's hide, as if to amplify the sound, to add his own courage to the melody. Lena, seeing the terror in the tiger's eyes, but also Akulina's unwavering courage, clutched the lamp even tighter, its tiny flame a stubborn beacon in the growing darkness. The old woman felt the presence of her ancestors, the strength of her lineage flowing through her veins. She wasn't alone. The sound of the tur was the voice of all of them, a silent chorus against the emptiness that threatened to swallow them. "They shall not pass," she murmured, her voice mingling with the drum's rhythm, transforming into a single melody of defiance. "This house is ours. This life is ours." Outside, the entity's hiss and lament momentarily subsided, replaced by a heavy silence, laden with expectation. It was a pause, not a retreat. Akulina knew the entity was gathering its strength for a final assault, a blow aimed at breaking their will, at extinguishing the light for good. The tur was her weapon, her shield. Akulina continued to play, the rhythm now constant, hypnotic, an ancestral melody of resistance. Her arms ached, her shoulders burned, but she wouldn't stop. The lives of her grandchildren, the hope of her clan, depended on every beat. Dawn was still far off, but the battle was in full swing, and Akulina, the old guardian, would not yield. The cabin trembled but did not fall. The cold bit but did not freeze hope. The heavy silence didn't last. A piercing lament, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air, erupted from outside the cabin. It wasn't a wind's howl, but a scream of fury and agony, laden with a chill that seemed to suck the warmth from everything it touched. The log cabin shuddered violently, the floorboards groaned, and a dry snap came from the roof, as if an invisible branch had broken under immense weight. The lamp's flame in Lena's hands dwindled to a tiny pinpoint, almost extinguishing, and darkness threatened to swallow the small glimmer of hope. Akulina didn't hesitate. She intensified the drum's rhythm, each beat a fierce response to the entity's assault. The deep, resonant thrum of the tur was no longer just a melody of resistance. It was a challenge, a roar of life that refused to be silenced. Her arms burned, her shoulder muscles protested, but physical pain was insignificant compared to the urgency of that moment. She felt the energy of her ancestors flow through her, a warm torrent that combated the paralyzing cold, a collective voice echoing in every strike of the beater. The tiger leader, positioned in front of the door, let out a thunderous roar that made the cabin vibrate. It wasn't a roar of fear, but of pure protective fury. The other felines, their golden eyes gleaming in the gloom, moved with it, forming a solid barrier of tense muscles and sharp claws. They didn't attack the invisible, but their presence, their determination, was a force in itself, a living shield against the emptiness that crashed against the walls. Semyon, his small hands still on the drum's hide, felt the ancestral vibration, a current that coursed through his body and pushed away fear. He looked at his grandmother, her blue eyes gleaming with fierce determination, and a glimmer of understanding passed through his childish mind. It wasn't just a drum, it was a heart, the heart of his family beating against the darkness. Lena, clutching the lamp against her chest, watched the tiny flame. Her breath caught in her throat, but her will unshakable. She would not let the light go out. The entity recoiled for an instant, its lament transforming into a hissing shriek of frustration and pain. But then, with renewed ferocity, it lunged again. A howling wind, sharper than steel, swept through the cabin, making the furs on the walls sway violently. The roof groaned again, and a cracking sound echoed closer this time. The cold became unbearable, a bone-piercing ache, and the air grew dense, heavy, as if life itself were being squeezed out. Akulina felt exhaustion descend upon her, an overwhelming weight that threatened to drag her to the floor. But she would not yield. The image of her parents, her grandparents, of all the generations who had survived in this icy wilderness shone in her mind. She was the guardian of the flame. With one last effort, she raised the beater and struck a series of blows on the drum, each one stronger, more resonant than the last. The sound of the tur exploded in the cabin, not like a beat, but like a shockwave, a torrent of energy that seemed to materialize, pushing back the cold and darkness. It wasn't just sound, it was light, warmth, life. The scent of burning herbs intensified, becoming a pungent aroma of earth and resin, an almost palpable shield that expanded, enveloping everyone in the log cabin. Outside, the entity's lament transformed into a final roar, a scream of anguish and defeat that seemed to tear the very night. The sound diminished, fading away, carried by a sudden wind that wasn't of cold, but of an emptiness that was dissipating. The pressure on the cabin abruptly ceased, and the air, previously dense and suffocating, became lighter, more breathable. The extreme cold receded, replaced by air that, though still icy, was bearable. Akulina collapsed onto the floor, the beater falling from her wrinkled hands. The tur still rested against her legs, but the rhythm had ceased. The silence that followed was deep, a silence that wasn't oppressive, but of relief. The lamp's flame in Lena's hands, previously almost extinguished, now burned with a steady, firm light, illuminating the pale but victorious faces of Semyon and Lena. The tiger leader let out a deep sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire battle. Its muscles relaxed, and it lay down heavily, its eyes still fixed on the door, but without the previous tension. The other felines followed its example. Some yawned, others nestled, as if a great burden had been lifted from their shoulders. Akulina, exhausted, but with an unbreakable spirit, looked at her grandchildren. Semyon's and Lena's eyes were wide, no longer with fear, but with an admiration and understanding that went beyond their young ages. They had witnessed the strength of their lineage, their grandmother's resilience. A faint glow began to seep through the cracks in the walls, a pale, silvery light announcing the end of the longest night they had ever known. The first light of dawn painted the icy horizon, bringing with it the promise of a new day, a new beginning. Akulina closed her eyes, breathing deeply the air that now carried only the smell of herb smoke and the clean scent of snow. The battle was won. The flame, kindled not with fire but with sound and intention, had burned away the darkness. The Tur, silenced for decades, had found its voice again, and with it, Akulina's and her grandchildren's hope had been reaffirmed, as imposing and unshakable as the very cold of Yakutia. The sun, a faint golden disk, began to rise slowly over the horizon, and Akulina knew that no matter what the future brought, they had survived. They had persevered.